Get out of my bedroom. I'm sorry, who are you? I'm Delia, I live here.
Clara, you're home early.
I'm home.
The bedroom door was open. That was the first thing Clara noticed. She always kept it closed. She stood at the top of the wide marble staircase. One hand braced on the railing, the other pressed flat against her belly. 8 months. 2 weeks until her due date. Her ankles were swollen inside her flats. Her back carried the particular ache of a woman hauling more than just a baby through the world. She had only come home early because her appointment ended fast. Dr. Beverly Harmon had said everything looked perfect. The baby was positioned well, head down, facing the right direction, ready, in the way babies get ready before the rest of life catches up to them. Clara had driven home in a warm haze of relief. She'd been thinking about the leftover chicken soup in the refrigerator. She'd been thinking about putting her feet up on the ottoman in the sunroom. She'd been thinking about the small white onesie she'd been folding and refolding for 3 weeks because it was the softest thing she had ever touched in her entire life. And then she heard it, a voice from behind the open bedroom door. Female, low, a little impatient. Bring the other one. No, the gray one. Grant, I said gray. Clara's hand tightened on the railing. She did not move. She stood very still the way you do when your body understands something your mind is still refusing to process. The way animals go still in tall grass. Something old and wordless kicking in beneath the thinking. A drawer closed. Heels crossed hardwood. The particular unhurried sound of a woman comfortable enough to cross a room without looking down at her feet. Clara walked to the door. She pushed it open with 2 fingers. The bedroom, her bedroom, with the cream curtains she had chosen from 3 different fabric shops, and the reading chair she had had recovered twice to get the color exactly right was different. Suitcases. Open. On her side of the bed, a silk blouse, pale ivory, laid across her pillow, and a woman standing at her vanity, holding Clara's favorite perfume, the one Grant had given her for their anniversary 2 years ago, wrapped in silver paper with a card that said simply, "You." The woman was turning the bottle over in her hand, considering it, like she was deciding whether to keep it or set it aside. The woman looked up. She had dark eyes, young skin, a face that had not yet learned how to hide surprise when it arrived. They stared at each other. 1 second. 2. And then the woman, this stranger, in Clara's bedroom, at Clara's vanity, holding Clara's perfume, said the words that would rewrite Clara Whitfield's entire life. Get out of my bedroom. Not with cruelty. That was the thing that would haunt Clara later, lying in the dark, going back over it. She said it without cruelty, without contempt. She said it with confusion, like she genuinely did not understand why Clara was standing there. Clara's mouth opened, closed. Her hand moved to her belly without her choosing to move it. Pure reflex. Pure protection. I'm sorry, Clara said very quietly. Who are you? The woman blinked. Something shifted across her face. Not guilt. Not exactly. Something closer to the expression of a person realizing in real time that they have been handed the wrong map and followed it a very long way in the wrong direction. I'm Delia, she said. I live here. The words fell like stones dropped into still water. Clara heard the front door downstairs, the familiar rhythm of Grant's footsteps in the entry hall, the way he always jangled his keys twice before setting them on the console table, a sound she had heard 10,000 times, a sound she had never once questioned. She did not move. She stood in the doorway of her own bedroom, 8 months pregnant, and she waited. Grant came up the stairs talking. Something about a conference call, something about the Langham Street development, something that required his full attention and none of hers. His voice was relaxed, easy, the voice of a man arriving somewhere he owns, somewhere nothing surprises him anymore. He turned the corner at the top of the stairs. He saw Clara. He stopped. For 1 second, just when she watched his face do something she had never seen it do before. It collapsed, not with guilt, not with fear, with the particular sudden flatness of a man whose careful, intricate architecture has met an unexpected wall and does not yet know how to reroute. Then he rebuilt it, fast, so practiced she might have missed it if she hadn't been watching so carefully. Clara, he said, you're home early. I'm home, she said. Just that. She looked at him. She looked at the open door behind her. She looked at the suitcases she could still see from where she stood. She looked at his face until he looked away first. And she thought, with a clarity so sharp it almost did not hurt yet, the way a clean cut takes a moment before the blood arrives, he moved her in. While I was still here, while I was 8 months pregnant with his child, he moved another woman into our bedroom. She did not scream. She went downstairs. She sat at the kitchen island. the same kitchen island where she had eaten breakfast 3 hours ago. She had been reading a book about infant sleep schedules, drinking decaf with oat milk, watching the morning light come through the east window in the particular golden way she had always loved. 3 hours ago. An entirely different life. She sat and she placed both hands flat on the cold marble. She breathed. In. Out. Slow. Her baby moved. A slow roll, heel pressing against her side. The body's most private kindness. "I'm still here," that movement said. "We're still here." She heard them upstairs. A heated whisper, low and urgent. Footsteps crossing the room, the sound of wheels on hardwood. She reached for her phone. She did not call Petra yet. Not because she didn't want to. She wanted to more than almost anything. She wanted to hear Petra's voice telling her this was real and she was not losing her mind. But she needed to know first. She needed to understand the shape of it before she said a single word to anyone. She needed the facts arranged clearly in front of her before the feelings arrived and rearranged everything. She set the phone face down on the marble. She sat very still, and she began very carefully to think. The mirror in the downstairs bathroom caught her reflection as she shifted on the stool. She looked at herself for a moment. 8 months pregnant. Dark circles under her eyes from 3 weeks of interrupted sleep. Hair pulled back in the way she always wore it now, practical and unthought about. She looked like a woman who had been carrying something heavy for a long time. She was only now beginning to understand how heavy. Delia came downstairs 20 minutes later. She had repacked her suitcases. She was dragging both of them, one in each hand, navigating the bottom of the stairs with the careful focus of someone who wants very much to leave without making it worse. She stopped when she saw Clara sitting at the island. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside the window, a car passed on the street. Then Delia said, "He told me you two had been separated for over a year. He said you were staying in the house temporarily to finalize the paperwork." Clara looked at her. He didn't mention. Delia's eyes dropped, briefly, to Clara's belly. They stayed there for one unguarded second. "He didn't tell me about the baby." "No," Clara said, "he wouldn't." Delia closed her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said. "For the perfume." For she stopped, started again, for all of it. "I genuinely did not know." Clara looked at this woman, this stranger who had slept in her bed, who had stood at her vanity holding her perfume as if it might belong to her. Clara believed her. That was the strangest part of all of it. She looked at Delia Hartman and she believed her completely. "I know," Clara said. Delia left. The front door closed with its familiar solid sound, and Clara sat down on the kitchen floor. Slowly, carefully, the way 8 months pregnant women lower themselves to floors, with one hand on the cabinet and the other on her belly, settling by degrees until she was sitting with her back against the lower cabinets and her legs out in front of her. She put her face in her hands. And for the first time since she had stood at the top of those stairs and heard a stranger's voice from behind an open door, she let herself cry. Grant came downstairs alone. He had taken off his jacket. He had rolled up his sleeves. He looked precisely like himself. He always looked precisely like himself. That was one of the most disorienting things about Grant Whitfield. He could walk into the center of a disaster he himself had created and still look like someone's idea of a capable, trustworthy man. The kind of man you would ask for directions. The kind of man who would give them confidently, even if he didn't know the way. He sat on the stool across the island from where Clara now stood. She had gotten up off the floor. She had splashed cold water on her face at the sink. She had dried her hands on the kitchen towel with the small embroidered lemons she had bought at a market in Savannah on a trip they had taken before the pregnancy. She remembered that trip. She remembered being happy on that trip. She was revising it now, page by page, the way you revise a document when you discover it was written from wrong information. Grant sat. He set his hands on the marble. He looked at her. He did not speak first. He was waiting to see what shape this conversation would take. Clara had understood this about him years ago. Grant never opened a negotiation. He waited for the other person to reveal what they knew, what they wanted, what they were afraid of. He assessed. He responded. He was always 3 moves ahead in his own mind. She had found this quality impressive once. She did not find it impressive now. She waited too. 30 seconds of kitchen silence. Grant exhaled slowly. "I can explain," he said. "I know you can," Clara said. "You're excellent at it." He looked at her, reassessing the terrain. "How long?" she asked. "Clara, how long, Grant?" He set his jaw. That small movement she had once read as strength, as resolve. Now she could read it for what it actually was. The calculation running underneath, how much to admit, what framing would land best, what version of the truth caused the least damage to the position he needed to maintain. 8 months, he said. The number landed like something dropped from a great height. 8 months. She was 8 months pregnant. She held very still. The way you hold still when you understand that if you move, something will break that cannot be put back together. Not the marriage. The marriage was already broken. Something else. Something in herself she needed to keep intact. She was here the entire time I was pregnant, Clara said. It was not a question he did not answer, which was its own answer. Clara thought about the past 8 months, the business trips, Chicago in January, Dallas in March, 9 days in Seattle in April. She had not questioned any of them. He traveled constantly. He always had. She had accepted his travel the way she had accepted everything about Grant's life as context, as given, as the weather she had chosen when she chose him. The nights he came home late smelling like restaurant air and expensive wine. She had been too exhausted from the pregnancy to do anything but ask if he'd eaten and go back to whatever book she was reading. The weekend in April when he said he had to fly to Seattle and she hadn't wanted to come because she'd been in her first trimester and terrified of adding any extra stress to those fragile early weeks. He took her to Seattle, Clara thought very quietly. He took her. While I was here being afraid to fly because I was trying so hard to keep our baby safe. She thought you were separated, Clara said. It was not a guess. She had seen it in Delia's face. That confusion. That specific expression of a person who has been given a map and trusted it, and only now understands the map was drawn by someone with reasons to mislead her. Grant blinked. Just barely. The tiniest flinch. Did she? Clara said. Not a question. He said nothing. He told her you were separated, Clara said again, to no one in particular. To herself. To whatever version of the last 2 years she was building now from the ground up, room by room, like a house she thought she knew the layout of by heart. He told her it had been mutual, that I was just staying for appearances. The refrigerator hummed. The clock on the wall moved. She stood up. Her back ached. She pressed one hand against it, the familiar motion, the constant negotiation with her own body these days. I need you to leave for tonight, she said. This is my house. Our house, she said. The deed is in both our names. She met his eyes and held them. I'm 8 months pregnant, Grant. My blood pressure needs to stay stable. Dr. Harmon has been very clear about that. If you want to make this a confrontation tonight, I can promise you it will become a medical event, and you will spend the remainder of this pregnancy on the wrong side of a hospital conversation. She paused. Or you can go. And let me have tonight. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Something that might have been in a different man, something close to shame. He picked up his jacket from the back of the stool. He was almost to the front door when she said, "What did you tell her about the baby?" He stopped. He did not turn around. His shoulders were very still. The back of his neck tightened almost imperceptibly. She doesn't know about the baby, he said. And he left. Clara stood in the kitchen for a very long time after the car pulled out of the drive. She checked her phone 3 times, locked it, unlocked it, locked it again. She set it face down on the counter and left it there. She walked to the pantry. She took down the box of plain crackers she kept on the second shelf. She ate 2 crackers standing at the counter, not because she was hungry, not because she wanted crackers, but because she needed something to do with her hands. Some small physical task that required nothing of her mind and everything of her fingers. She put the box back on the shelf. She went to the window and watched the red taillights disappear at the end of the long drive. And then she allowed herself, just for a moment, to feel the full weight of the specific grief she was being asked to carry. The grief of realizing that the person you loved was never quite the person you believed you were loving. That the man who held your face and cried when you told him you were pregnant had already been living a different life. That the tenderness you had received and been grateful for and thought was real was a performance put on by a man managing his own guilt with the precision he brought to every other project in his life. God, she thought. 8 months. He was doing this the whole time I was growing his child. She pressed her forehead to the cool glass of the window. I thought I was building a family. He was building a second life. She did not cry again. She was too tired to cry right now. She picked up her phone and she called Petra. Petra answered on the second ring. What happened? Petra said. Why do you assume something happened? Clara said. Because you don't call after 9 on a weeknight unless something happened. Talk to me. So Clara talked. She stood at the window in her kitchen and she told Petra everything from the beginning. The appointment, the soup she'd been thinking about, the open door at the top of the stairs, the voice, the woman at the vanity with the perfume, the suitcases on her side of the bed, the sentence, "Get out of my bedroom," the confession at the kitchen island, the 8 months. All of it. Petra was completely quiet through all of it. She did not interject, she did not gasp. She listened the way she had always listened, completely, the way very few people actually listen, with her whole attention. When Clara finished, Petra said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully right now." "Okay," Clara said. "Do not touch anything in that house. Do not send him any texts. Do not send any emails, nothing in writing, nothing at all tonight." "Petra, I mean it, Clara. Your first move matters more than any other move you will make in this entire situation." "Where is she?" "The woman? I think she left. I heard her take her bags downstairs." "Good. You're going to go sit down right now. You're going to drink a full glass of water, and you're going to text me the moment you feel okay. I'm coming over. You really don't need to, Clara." Petra's voice was quiet and completely steady. "Where else would I possibly be?" Petra arrived at 10 past 10. She came in through the back door, which she had her own key to, which meant she had already stopped at the bakery on 5th Street that stayed open until 11 because the owner kept artist hours and didn't believe in early closing. She arrived with a white box of the shortbread cookies with the lavender glaze that Clara had loved since they were 22 years old, and sharing a 2-room apartment the size of a large closet, eating cereal for dinner 3 nights a week, and thinking they were living the most interesting lives imaginable. Petra set the box on the counter. She looked at Clara. She did not say anything for a full 10 seconds. "You look terrible," Petra said. "I'm aware," Clara said. "Come sit down." They sat at the kitchen table. Not the island, the table, where there was room for both of them to spread out. Petra poured water into 2 glasses from the pitcher in the refrigerator. She put the cookie box between them and opened it. She sat down and folded her hands on the table and said, "Tell me from the beginning. I told you on the phone. Tell me again, slower this time." So Clara told it again, and the second time it was worse than the first. The second time she could hear the shape of it differently. She could hear the gaps, all the places where she had been unconsciously filling in space with trust, with generosity of interpretation, with "he's just busy, and that's just how he is, and things will get easier after the baby comes. And this is what long marriages feel like. This is normal. This is just how it goes." She had been spackling the holes in the wall for so long she had stopped noticing the holes. "The Amsterdam trip," Clara said suddenly. Petra looked up from her water glass. "In February," Clara said. "He said it was investors, Dutch investors, a development group. He said it was crucial and couldn't be done by phone. He was gone 9 days. She shook her head slowly, the motion of someone dislodging something that has been stuck. "I had just told him I was pregnant. 3 days before he left. He held me in the kitchen, right here in this kitchen, and he cried. He actually cried, Petra. Real tears. I felt them on my neck." "I remember," Petra said. "You called me the next morning. You said it felt like a turning point. You said you thought maybe everything was going to be different." "He cried," Clara said. "He cried about our baby, and then he took her to Amsterdam for 9 days. The words settled between them like sediment. Petra reached across the table and put her hand over Clara's. They sat there in the late-night quiet of the kitchen, and Clara went back through 8 months of her own memory, the way you walk back through a house after an earthquake, checking each room for damage, finding cracks in walls you thought were solid. The Tuesday nights he worked late. The phone he always kept face down on the table during dinner, every single dinner for 2 years. And she had thought this was just his relationship with work, his inability to fully disconnect, something she had accepted as part of the package of being married to a man like Grant. The way he'd moved his home office downstairs at the beginning of her second trimester. He had said he didn't want the light from his monitor disturbing her sleep, didn't want the sound of his calls waking her during the night when she needed rest. He didn't want me to hear his calls, Clara thought now. He moved himself downstairs so he could talk to her without me knowing. "The nursery," Clara said. "What about the nursery?" Petra said. "He designed it himself. He hired the decorator and he showed up at every single meeting. He had opinions about the gray for the walls, about which crib, about the mobile with the wooden birds." She paused. "I thought it meant he was excited, that he was finally showing up in the way I'd been waiting for him to show up, that the baby was bringing him back to me." She could see it now with perfect, terrible clarity. It had been guilt. Elaborate, expensive, meticulously managed guilt. He had built the nursery the way some men send extravagant flower arrangements, not to make someone feel loved, to manage their own discomfort, to reduce the pressure in their own chest, to be able to look at himself in the mirror and say, "I'm doing everything I can. Look what I'm building." "The signs were there," Clara said quietly. "They were always there." "Stop right now," Petra said. "I'm not, you are. You're standing at the edge of blaming yourself for trusting a person who was deliberately, systematically lying to you. Don't do that. Don't go there." Clara looked at her hands on the table. He is very good at it, Clara said. That's what I keep coming back to. He is remarkably good at it. There's almost an artistry to it.
I know, Petra said.
He made me feel watched over, Clara said, protected, safe in a particular way, and I mistook control for care. For years, I thought the quietness in our marriage was peace. I thought the distance between us was just how mature marriages feel after the early intensity fades. I thought it was normal. I thought I was adjusting my expectations appropriately. Petra was quiet. He never loved me, Clara said. The words came out flat, not hysterical, not performed, almost academic, the way a scientist states something they have just finished proving with the last piece of evidence. He loved the idea of me, Clara said. The architect wife with good taste who would run the house beautifully and entertain his clients and not ask too many uncomfortable questions. The right kind of woman in the right kind of frame for the right kind of life he was constructing. Clara, I'm not being dramatic. I really genuinely think. She pressed one hand to her eyes. I think I was a role in his life, Petra, a very important role, a well-cast role. And I played it so completely for so long that neither of us noticed for a very long time that there was no actual relationship underneath the performance. The clock on the wall ticked. Once. Twice. Somewhere along the way, Clara thought I became invisible. And I was so grateful for the security in the beautiful house and the sense of being chosen by someone like Grant Whitfield that I didn't notice I was disappearing. The validation whisper the story keeps returning to. You were not foolish to trust. You were betrayed by someone practiced in the art of betrayal. Those are not the same thing. Petra stayed until midnight. She ate 4 cookies. She made Clara eat 3. She refilled the water glasses twice and did not once say the words "I told you so," or "I always thought," or any of the things that people sometimes cannot resist saying when they have been quietly worried about a friend's marriage and kept their worry to themselves. Before she left, she said, "I know someone, a family attorney. She's exceptionally good and she's the one you want for this." "I'm not ready for that yet," Clara said. "You don't have to be ready. You just have to have the number." Petra pressed a business card into Clara's hand. "And first thing in the morning, before you do anything else, before you respond to Grant, before you talk to anyone in his family called Douglas Fairchild." Clara looked up from the card. "Grant's attorney?" "The Whitfield family attorney," Petra said with careful precision. "He's worked for the Whitfield estate for 30 years. He worked for James Whitfield long before he worked for Grant. That's a significant difference." Her eyes were steady. "Call him first. Before Grant does." After Petra left, Clara walked slowly through the house. She did it deliberately, room by room, with the lights low and her hand trailing the door frames. She walked through the front rooms with their museum-perfect furniture that she had selected and arranged and cared for. The office she had been trained to never enter. The library where Grant kept his first editions behind glass. The formal dining room with the long table and the candelabra she had found at an estate sale in Connecticut and spent 3 weeks having restored. She had built this house, not constructed it, but inhabited it, made it into what it was, given it warmth and specificity and the particular quality of being lived in by a person who paid attention. And then she came to the sunroom. It had always been her favorite room in the house. Too warm in summer, too cold in winter, impractical in every season, and she had loved it anyway because of the light and because of the orange tree she had planted in a large terracotta pot 3 years ago from a cutting she had smuggled home in her coat pocket from a friend's garden. She stood in the sunroom and she looked at the orange tree. It had 2 small oranges on it now. Stubborn, slow-growing, deeply persistent. She had grown this. She had kept it alive through 2 winters and a drought summer, and neglect during the first trimester when she could barely keep herself upright. She had built real things in this house. The orange tree was real. The library was real. The kitchen garden outside the east window was real. The baby was real. And whatever comes next, she thought, that is going to be real too. Whatever I build from here will be mine in a way this never fully was. She went upstairs. She stripped the sheets from her side of the bed with steady, methodical hands. She put fresh ones on. She lay down. She pressed her hands over her belly. Her baby moved. That slow, reliable movement. That constant answer. "I'm here," the movement said. "We're here." Clara did not sleep for a very long time. She called Douglas Fairchild at 8 o'clock in the morning. He answered before the second ring. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said. His voice was measured, professional. The voice of a man who has spent 30 years holding other people's most complicated situations and has learned to carry weight without letting it alter his posture. "I need to speak with you," Clara said. "Not as Grant's attorney, as the attorney for the Whitfield family estate." A pause. Brief. Thoughtful. The pause of a man who understood exactly what she was saying and what it meant that she was saying it. "Of course," he said. "Can you come in this morning?" She arrived at his office at 10 o'clock. It was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, and the elevator opened onto a reception area with dark wood paneling and a quality of stillness that suggested serious things happened here and were handled with care. Clara had been here only twice before, once to sign the property deed, once when she and Grant had updated their joint trust after the pregnancy was confirmed, sitting side by side in matching chairs while Douglas walked them through provisions, and she had felt, that day, so certain about the shape of her future. Douglas Fairchild was 60 years old and looked it in a way that inspired confidence rather than doubt. He had the kind of face that had earned its lines. He stood when she entered, and there was something in his expression when he took in the full picture of her, the pregnancy, the dark circles that remained despite her best efforts, the particular careful composure of a woman holding herself together through an act of sustained will that shifted, briefly, from professional to quietly, genuinely human. He came around the desk and shook her hand with both of his. "Sit down, please," he said. She sat. She folded her hands in her lap. "I'll be direct," she said. "Yesterday I discovered that Grant has been maintaining an intimate relationship with another woman for at least the past 8 months. He had moved her into our home, into our bedroom, without my knowledge. I'm asking you to tell me as an attorney who represents the Whitfield estate and not Grant Whitfield personally what my position is." Douglas looked at her for a long moment. "Does Grant know you're here?" he asked. "No," she said. He nodded. He sat back down behind the desk. He folded his own hands. "I need to tell you something first," he said, "as a matter of professional ethics and, I'll be honest, personal conscience." "Of course," she said. "I represent the Whitfield Family Trust," he said. "That trust predates Grant's marriage to you by many years. My obligation runs to the trust itself and to its designated beneficiaries." He paused. He looked at her steadily. "One of those beneficiaries is your unborn child." Clara went very still. "James Whitfield amended the trust before he died," Douglas said. 14 months ago, when he was ill and understood, he did not have much time. He added a provision. He opened a folder on the desk in front of him. He added a subtrust designation for Grant's first biological child. The provision is irrevocable. It holds regardless of the marital status of the parents at the time of the child's birth. It cannot be dissolved by Grant. It cannot be renegotiated, contested, or modified without unanimous consent of the trust's independent board, which James appointed specifically to ensure it could not be manipulated. Clara's hands tightened in her lap. Her knuckles went white. "How much?" she asked. Douglas looked at her. $40 million, he said, "in liquid assets and professionally managed funds, set aside and protected, every dollar of it belonging irrevocably to the child you are carrying." The room went very quiet. Clara heard the air conditioning cycling. She heard, very faintly, the sound of traffic 14 floors below, all those ordinary lives moving at their ordinary pace. "Grant doesn't know about this provision," Douglas said carefully. "His father was very specific that Grant should not be informed. He told me," he paused. He chose his next words. "He told me he believed Grant had certain qualities that made it necessary to protect his grandchild's future through a channel Grant could not access or influence." "James knew," Clara said softly. She heard the words as she said them. "James knew. This whole time. He knew what his son was. And he spent his last healthy months quietly, meticulously building a wall around my baby." "James Whitfield was a man who had watched his son very carefully for 40 years, Douglas said. "And he was fond of you, Mrs. Whitfield. He told me so directly more than once. He said you were the kind of person who deserved better than what Grant had to offer." Clara looked at the window. She thought about James Whitfield, 71 when he died. Formal in the old-fashioned way, the way men of his era could be, somewhat stiff in casual settings, more comfortable with a glass of bourbon and a considered opinion than with displays of open warmth. But there had been warmth. It surfaced in small, specific ways. He always asked about her work, her projects, her ideas, what she'd been reading. He had brought her a book about Japanese garden architecture on his last visit, from a small academic press, with a handwritten note tucked into the front cover. "Clara, for the garden you will build when you have the time and the ground to build it in. James." She had kept the note. It was in her bedside drawer. He'd known. And he had loved his grandchild before his grandchild existed. He had made arrangements. He had done the most practical, most lasting thing he could do with the love he had. Clara pressed both hands to her eyes and held them there. "What do I do?" she asked, not helplessly. The question of a woman who has just seen the terrain clearly for the first time and is ready to begin mapping a route. "First," Douglas said, You retain your own attorney. I can give you 3 names. All of them are excellent. Petra Solis gave me a name last night, Clara said. Margaret Holt. Margaret is exceptional, Douglas said. Call her today. He slid a piece of paper across the desk. Second, document everything you observed yesterday. The suitcases. The woman. What was said by each person and in what order. The time you arrived home, the time Grant arrived, the time the woman left. Write it down today while it is precise in your memory. Clara nodded. Third, he said, and his voice took on a slightly different quality here, the quality of a man saying the most important thing, do not leave the house. The house, she said. The property is marital, he said. As long as you are physically resident there, your presence protects your legal interests in the most direct way possible. If Grant asks you to leave for any reason, with any justification, you are not required to go, and he cannot compel you. Are you physically safe in that house? She thought about the question honestly, turning it over. I am not afraid of him physically, she said. He is cold. He is strategic. But he is not a man who expresses himself through violence. He is a man who expresses himself through control, and control through conversation, and I know what those conversations look like. Good, Douglas said. Then stay. He walked her to the elevator. As the doors opened, he said, Mrs. Whitfield, James was right to trust his instincts about you. I hope you'll come to see everything that is happening right now, all of it. Even the hardest parts as a beginning. Not only as an ending, she stepped into the elevator. She thought about the orange tree in the sunroom. Stubborn, slow-growing, persistent. I'm starting to, she said. Grant called at noon. She let it ring through to voicemail. He texted at 12:15. We need to talk. I'm sorry about last night. Can we have dinner and talk this through? She read it 3 times. She placed the phone face down on the kitchen island. She made the leftover chicken soup, the soup she had been thinking about on the drive home yesterday, in another life. She heated it slowly on the stove. She poured it into the wide bowl she liked best, and she sat at the table and ate it slowly. Her baby moved the entire time she was eating. That rolling, pushing, insistent movement. A person already taking up space with complete conviction. Take all the space you want, Clara thought. Take every bit of it. At 2 in the afternoon, Nora Whitfield called. Grant's mother, 67 years old. Elegant in the particular way of women who grew up with money and were taught that elegance was simply the correct mode of being. Clara had always experienced Nora as someone who liked her in the abstract but found her specific reality somewhat inconvenient. Clara considered letting it go to voicemail. She answered. I heard there was some unpleasantness yesterday, Nora said. That was Nora's register for everything that had ever happened in this family. Unpleasantness. Your son moved his girlfriend into our bedroom while I'm 8 months pregnant, Clara said. I would describe it as something considerably stronger than unpleasantness. Nora sighed. The specific, exhausted sigh of a woman who has spent 50 years managing the consequences of men's decisions while the men themselves moved on to the next decision. Clara, you need to understand the way Grant operates. I do understand, Clara said. That's the problem, Nora. I understand it very clearly now. What do you want? Nora asked. Direct as always. Clara might have admired it on a different day, in a different conversation. What I want, Clara said, is for your son to have made different choices for the past 8 months. I can't have that. So what I want now is for everyone in Grant's personal and professional circle to understand that I am not going to disappear quietly. I'm not going to be managed or maneuvered into any arrangement that doesn't fully protect me and my child. She paused. And I want you to tell your son to have his attorney contact mine. A silence. You've already retained someone, Nora said. I retained someone this morning, Clara said. Another silence, longer than the first. You're smarter than Grant gives you credit for, Nora said. Yes, Clara said. I am. She ended the call. She set the phone down and sat very still in the kitchen for a moment, and then she felt it. Underneath the anger, underneath the grief, underneath all of it. Something quieter and stranger. Something that felt almost impossibly like relief. The door had been unlocked all along. She had simply been so certain she was supposed to stay inside that she had never tried the handle. Grant came home at 6 in the evening. He was carrying flowers, white lilies. Extravagant, long-stemmed, wrapped in brown paper from the florist on Merchant Street. The kind of flowers he used to bring every Thursday in the first year of their marriage, arriving at the door with them like a man who had decided to make Thursday a ritual, who wanted to be the kind of husband who brought flowers on ordinary days. He had not brought flowers in 2 years. Clara looked at the lilies and felt something close to a dark, exhausted laugh rise in her chest. She did not let it out. You can put those down, she said. And yes, we can talk. He set the lilies on the counter. He pulled out the chair across from her at the kitchen table and he sat down. He looked at her with the expression she had come to understand was his sincere expression. Open, present, the eyes clear and focused on her face. He was very good at the sincere expression. She had trusted the sincere expression for 8 years. I made a catastrophic mistake, he said. I'm not going to insult you by pretending otherwise or trying to minimize what you saw. I made a serious mistake and I understand that. She waited. He looked at his hands on the table. He looked back up at her. What were you planning, Clara asked. For what? For after the baby came, she said. What was the actual plan, Grant? Was she going to stay in the house and we would simply occupy different floors and pretend? Or were you going to ask me to leave once the baby came? Present the situation as inevitable? Tell Delia I had finally agreed to move out? She watched his face with the calm attention of a scientist observing a reaction. I want to understand the actual plan. Not the apology, the plan. He looked at his hands again. I hadn't fully thought it through, he said. That is a lie, Clara said gently, not with anger. Almost clinically, the way you correct a factual error in a report. You think everything through. It is your defining quality. You do not make unplanned moves. You do not act without considering the downstream consequences. It's what makes you good at what you do. She held his gaze. So tell me the actual plan. He said nothing. Were you going to wait until the baby was born, she said, and then approach me with a separation agreement? When I was at my most exhausted, when I was sleep-deprived and physically recovering and emotionally consumed with a newborn, when I was at my least capable of fighting back. She let the question sit in the air. That was the plan. The timing was deliberate. The silence that followed was its own answer. Grant had always understood that silence could be used, could be shaped, could sometimes do more than words. She had learned this from watching him. She was watching him use it now. Clara nodded slowly. Okay, she said. Clara, listen, I'm not angry right now, she said. I want you to hear that. I moved through anger yesterday evening and I am past it now. What I am is clear. She looked at him steadily. I'm just understanding who you are. Without the story I've been layering over you for 8 years. Without the generous interpretations and the benefit of the doubt and the hope that things were going to become what I needed them to be, just you. Just what's actually true. He leaned forward. We can repair this. For the sake of the baby, Clara, we can... Don't, she said. Her voice did not rise. Don't use the baby as a reason for me to accept being treated the way you have treated me. That is precisely the kind of reasoning I will not accept going forward. The baby is why I need things to be honest and clear and safe. The baby is not a reason for me to stay in a situation that is none of those things. He sat back. He looked at her with the assessment eyes now. Not the sincere eyes, the real ones. Measuring. I've already spoken to an attorney, Clara said. Something moved very quickly across his face. There and gone. Who, he said. She did not answer. He absorbed that. He nodded slowly, carefully. That's your right, he said.
Yes, it is. I want you to sleep in the guest suite, Clara said.
Starting tonight, until we have something formal in place. He looked at her. She met his eyes and did not look away. Fine, he said. He went upstairs. Clara sat at the table until she heard the guest suite door close with its quiet, definitive sound. And then she put her head down on her folded arms on the table, and she let herself feel it, all of it at once. The full accumulated weight of everything she had been carrying. 8 months of loneliness she had named peace. 8 months of carrying his child while he built a second life somewhere just out of her sight. The night she had reached across the bed and found him there, but somehow not there. The way she had redecorated the nursery closet 3 times, because she had nothing better to do with the longing for a partner who had already decided to leave in every way except physically. I deserve better than this. The thought arrived fully formed without drama. I have always deserved better than this. Not because I am remarkable, because everyone does. She woke at 2 in the morning, snapping awake, heart already going. That particular alarm bell quality of a body that has been holding too much tension for too long and cannot maintain sleep through it. She pressed her hands to her belly. The baby moved immediately, reliably. Here, thank God. But there was pressure, something low and spreading. A heaviness that was different from the usual late pregnancy discomfort, something that required attention. She called Dr. Harmon's answering service. She called Petra. She sat on the edge of the bed and breathed, carefully, counting the inhale, counting the exhale. The service said Dr. Harmon would return the call within 10 minutes. She did not knock on the guest suite door. She sat very still and breathed and waited. Petra answered on the first ring. Her voice was rough with sleep. Clara. Something might be wrong, Clara said. I don't know. There's pressure. The baby is moving, but there's pressure that isn't right. I'm coming right now, Petra said. Don't move. Is Grant in the house? Guest suite. Wake him up. She did not want to. She genuinely, deeply did not want to. But the pressure intensified, spreading, real. She stood up. She walked down the hall. She knocked. Grant opened the door almost immediately. He had not been asleep either. She looked at his face. He looked at hers. She did not have to say a single word. I'll get the car, he said. At the hospital, Dr. Harmon said it was early labor. Not dangerous, controlled, but real. She looked at the blood pressure numbers on the monitor and she said, with calm authority, the stress is measurable in these numbers. You need to stay here tonight. They gave Clara a room with a window. They put the monitoring cuff on her arm. They gave her ice chips and a television she did not turn on. Grant sat in the vinyl chair in the corner. He sat there all night. Clara did not ask him to leave. Not because she had forgiven anything. Not because any of what she understood had changed. But because in that room, under those lights, with the monitors making their steady soft sounds, the two of them were held in place by something larger than the wreckage of their marriage. There was a child, a real actual child, coming into the world whether or not any of the rest of it made sense, deserving to arrive in whatever measure of peace they could manage to create for her. At 4 in the morning, when the contractions had slowed and Dr. Harmon said the baby had settled again, Clara turned her head and looked at Grant in the corner chair. He was asleep. His jacket folded under his head, his face in sleep younger than it was awake. He looked for one strange unguarded moment like the man she had first met at a dinner party 12 years ago. Before all of this. Before she understood what she was looking at, she looked at him, and she felt something she had not expected to feel. Not love, not hate, grief, clean and uncomplicated, for the marriage she had believed in, for the partnership she had tried to build, for the years she had given to a story that had not been true. And underneath the grief, solid as bedrock, I'm going to be okay. My baby is going to be okay. James Whitfield built a wall around her future that Grant cannot touch, and I am going to build the rest. She closed her eyes. She slept. She came home the next afternoon. Dr. Harmon said rest, said calm, said 36 hours minimum of deliberate low stress, and said it with the quiet authority of a woman who had seen enough cases where stress had its way with a body to know this was not a suggestion. Clara had smiled and agreed and meant it. And then 2 hours after she got home, while Grant was in the guest suite on what sounded like an extended conference call, and the house was quiet around her, she walked to the door of his office. She stood in front of it. She had never done this. He had never explicitly forbidden her. He hadn't needed to. He had built a culture of privacy around the room over the years, always closing the door behind him, always carrying his laptop in and out rather than leaving it on the desk, always being in the room when she might otherwise have entered it. She had read the implicit boundary and she had respected it, because she respected him and trusted his need for professional privacy. She reached out and turned the handle. The door opened. She went in. She was not looking for anything specific. She was looking for understanding, for the actual architecture of the parallel life he had been constructing alongside the one they nominally shared. She needed to see it, to comprehend the real shape of it. The office smelled like him. Leather and the particular wood polish he liked, and faintly underneath, the expensive soap he ordered from a shop in London. The desk was immaculate. Grant was always immaculate in his organizational systems. A place for everything. Everything accounted for. She looked through the bookshelf first. Investment files in labeled binders. Property portfolio documents organized by development name and date. Nothing she did not expect. She went to the desk. She tried the top drawer. Locked, the second drawer opened. Inside was a series of hanging files. She flicked through the tabs. Legal correspondence. Permit documents. Contract records. And then a folder, thicker than the others, labeled in Grant's precise handwriting, Eastbridge. She knew that name. Eastbridge was Grant's flagship current project, 45 acres in the northeastern district. Mixed-use development, announced with enormous fanfare 18 months ago at a gala she had attended, standing beside him in a navy dress, listening to him speak about community investment and responsible development and the future of the city. She opened the folder. She was not a lawyer, she was an architect. She had spent 12 years in the world of urban development, reading site plans, navigating permit processes, sitting in planning commission meetings, understanding how the machinery of city development actually functioned. She knew what the documents inside this folder were. She read. She stood at the desk and she read every page. She understood slowly at first, and then all at once, the way you recognize the shape of something only when you've seen enough of it to connect the image. Grant had obtained the East Bridge permits by routing payments through a shell company to 3 members of the city's planning commission. The payments were detailed in an internal memo. Names, dates, amounts, the nature of each transaction and what it had purchased in terms of approved variances. It was not deeply hidden. It was filed, in a drawer, in his private office. Filed by a man who had never in his professional life encountered a consequence significant enough to teach him to be more careful. Filed by a man who could not imagine that anyone with access to this room would use what they found in it. Clara stood at the desk for a long time. Her hands were completely steady. She had expected them to shake. She took out her phone. She photographed every single page of the folder, each one carefully, fully in frame, sharp and clear. She placed the folder back in the drawer exactly as she had found it. Exactly the same position. She closed the drawer. She walked out of the office and pulled the door closed behind her with the same soft click it had made when she opened it. She went to the kitchen. She stood at the window and looked at the garden. She thought about what she was holding. Not just her child's secured future. Not just her own legal and financial protection. But the thing Grant Whitfield cared about above everything else in his life. Above his marriage. Above his child. Above his comfort and his convenience and his second life. His reputation, his name, his empire. She had not gone looking for a weapon. She had gone looking for the truth. And the truth had been sitting in an unlocked drawer waiting for someone willing to open it. She called Douglas Fairchild. "I need to meet with you tomorrow morning," she said, "and I need you to explain my legal obligations if I have discovered evidence of financial crimes committed by my spouse." A brief silence. "That is a very precise question," Douglas said. "I am a very precise person," she said. "Come in at 9, he said, "and bring whatever you found." She went to the sunroom. She sat in the rattan chair beside the orange tree. She picked up one of the small oranges and held it in her palm. It was cool and slightly waxy, and it smelled clean and green and entirely itself. She sat for an hour. She did not think about Grant. She thought about the architecture practice she had walked away from when she married him. The small firm she had been building, landscape architecture, urban green spaces, the living connective tissue between buildings where actual human life happened. She had been genuinely good at it. She had been excited by it in the specific, private, sustaining way of someone who has found the work they are meant to do. She had set it aside because Grant's life was vast and demanding, and she had believed the way she had believed so many things that she could return to it later, that there would be time, that there would be a version of later where she would pick up her pencils and her license and her own ambitions and find them waiting. Later had arrived. She sat in the sunroom with the small orange in her hand, and she thought about what a good life actually looked like. A smaller house. A house that was hers. A garden she had planted herself. A child who would grow up watching her mother make something, build something, create something, stay somewhere she belonged. For the first time in a very long time, it did not feel impossible. It felt like a plan taking its first solid shape. She did not plan to call Delia. It happened because Delia called her. 2 days after the hospital, Clara was in the nursery. She was reorganizing the bottom shelf of the changing table, not because it needed reorganizing, not because anything was wrong with the order it was in, but because she needed to do something with her hands that was quiet and purposeful and entirely her own, something that was about the baby and nothing else. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost let it go. She answered. "This is Delia Hartman," the voice said. "I got your number from it. Doesn't matter how I got it. I'm sorry to call without warning. A pause, a breath. The sound of someone who has rehearsed something and then forgotten the rehearsal the moment the call connected. I think there are things you need to know." Clara sat down in the white rocking chair in the center of the nursery. She looked at the mobile above the crib, the little wooden birds hanging on their strings. She had chosen each one. "Tell me," she said. What Delia told her took 40 minutes. Grant had met Delia 3 years ago. Not 8 months. 3 years ago, at a private event for one of his development projects, and it had started slowly and then become serious, and then, in the 3rd year, this past year, the year of Clara's pregnancy, it had become something Grant described to Delia as his real life. "He told me the separation had been mutual," Delia said. Her voice was controlled. She had clearly done her crying before making this call. "He said you had grown in different directions. He said it had been a long time coming and you had both agreed it was the right thing. He said you were staying in the house temporarily for appearances because of his business and because you both thought it was cleaner to make the announcement after the holidays." Clara listened. "He didn't tell me about the baby," Delia said. "I want to be very clear about that. When he came to me 6 weeks ago and said he was ready for us to be public, ready for me to come to the house. I had no idea there was a pregnancy. I would not have, she stopped. I would not have come if I had known. I want you to hear that. I heard it, Clara said. I believe you. A pause. He said the baby had been a mistake, Delia said quietly, that it complicated the timing, but that it didn't change what he had decided. Clara heard those words. She held them. He had called their child a complication. He had stood in this kitchen and cried real tears when she told him she was pregnant. He had built the nursery with painstaking attention to every detail. And then behind her back, he had told another woman that the baby was a mistake that complicated the timing. He asked you to move in, Clara said. He said you would be moving to your sister's place within the week. He said it was all arranged. He said I could start bringing things. Delia exhaled. I packed for 3 days before I came. I chose which books to bring. I thought, she stopped. It doesn't matter what I thought. I was wrong about almost everything. Why are you telling me this? Clara asked. Not with accusation, with genuine curiosity. Because I was lied to, Delia said. For 3 years I was given a story that wasn't true, and I built everything on top of it. And now the story has collapsed, and I'm left standing in the rubble of it. And because you deserve to know the actual shape of what happened. She paused. And because he called me from the hospital. Clara was very still. The night you were there, Delia said. He called me the next morning. He said you had used the hospital visit strategically, that you had manufactured a situation to create sympathy and make things legally complicated for him. Her voice was tight. I believed him then. I don't believe him now. I don't believe much of anything he's told me now. The baby is fine, Clara said. We're both fine. Good, Delia said. And then very quietly, I'm sorry. For my part in all of it. For the bedroom. For not knowing what I should have looked harder to find out. You were also lied to, Clara said. You were given the wrong map by someone very skilled at drawing wrong maps. I know what that's like. A silence. Thank you, Delia said. I mean it, Clara said. After she hung up, she sat in the rocking chair for a long time. She thought about Grant in the hospital corridor, stepping away from the waiting room to call Delia, framing his pregnant wife's early labor as a manipulation, managing his secondary relationship even while she lay in a hospital bed with monitors on her belly. She thought about what she held in her hands now, the photographs on her phone. A witness who had been there for 3 years and whose account could not be discredited or dismissed. The irrevocable trust James Whitfield had built for Frances. Douglas Fairchild, who understood the full landscape and was quietly, firmly on the right side of it. And Margaret Holt, who she would meet on Thursday and who Petra had described as the most capable family attorney she had ever encountered. The most unexpected person had become her ally. The woman who had walked into her bedroom with her suitcases had become the one who told her the truth. That was the thing about Grant's systems. He had constructed them so carefully that he had not accounted for what happened when the people inside them started talking to each other. She looked at the wooden birds on the mobile above the crib. She thought, Frances. I'm going to name her Frances. She didn't know yet where the name had come from. It had simply arrived. Settled, felt right. She filed it away and held it carefully, like the orange she'd carried home in her coat pocket 3 years ago. She met with Margaret Holt on a Thursday morning. Margaret was 53 years old. She had the kind of face that revealed nothing it didn't choose to reveal, and the kind of stillness that suggested she had heard most things at least once, and was not easily surprised by any of them. She was deeply, quietly competent in the way that does not need to perform itself. She did not decorate her confidence. It simply sat in the room with her. Clara sat across the wide desk, and she told Margaret everything. She told it in order, methodically. She put her phone on the desk, and she opened the photographs, and she handed the phone across. Margaret looked at every image with complete, unhurried attention. She did not react while she read. She asked 3 questions. She made notes in a small leather-bound notebook in handwriting that was small and precise. Then she set the phone down and looked at Clara. You understand what you're looking at, Margaret said. I'm not a lawyer, Clara said. But I've spent 12 years in the development world. I know what I read. What you read, Margaret said, is evidence of bribery, of at least 3 sitting members of the city's planning commission. Specific, documented, dated evidence. She paused. This is a criminal matter, Mrs. Whitfield. Not only a divorce matter. This goes considerably beyond divorce. I know, Clara said. What do you want to do with it? Clara had thought about this question for many days. She had thought about it sitting in the sunroom with the orange tree. She had thought about it at 2 in the morning watching the ceiling. She had thought about it in the parking lot of Douglas Fairchild's building, sitting in the car for 7 minutes before she could make herself go inside, and in the hospital waiting for her blood pressure numbers to stabilize. She had thought about revenge. She had held the idea of it for a while, turned it over, examined it from different angles. She had put it down. Revenge was expensive and prolonged and required continued proximity to the thing that had hurt you. She did not want prolonged proximity to Grant Whitfield. She wanted to be finished. "I want a divorce," Clara said. "I want full physical custody with generous visitation for Grant, clearly defined and contingent on his continued cooperation and behavior. I want the house or its full cash equivalent. I have researched the current market value. I want my legal fees covered in full. I want a settlement that accounts for the years I spent supporting his professional life at the expense of my own career." She paused. "I want all of this resolved within 60 days. I want to have it finalized before the baby comes." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "And the Eastbridge documents?" she asked. "I want Grant to know I have them," Clara said. "I don't want to file them unless he makes it necessary. I believe that once he understands what I hold, the terms I'm asking for will seem not only reasonable but straightforward." She met Margaret's eyes. "The alternative for him is considerably worse. I think he will be able to do that math very quickly." Margaret was quiet for another moment. "You have thought this through with considerable care," she said. "I have had time," Clara said. She told Grant that evening. She set the table. Not the kitchen island, the dining room table. The formal one with the chairs she had found in a shop in Vermont and had shipped across 3 states. She wanted the formality. She needed him to understand that this was not a conversation that could be redirected or softened or turned into a negotiation about feelings. This was a meeting. He came in, he saw the table set, he looked at her, he sat down, she put a document on the table between them. "My terms," she said. "Please read." He picked it up. He read. She watched his jaw tighten once, briefly, and then his face went carefully neutral, the professional face, the one he wore in boardrooms and negotiations where showing a reaction was a disadvantage. "The house is not," he began. "Turn to the second page," she said. He turned the page. She watched him read. She had seen Grant Whitfield in many states. Confident, impatient, conciliatory, dismissive, strategic. She had never seen him look the way he looked right now. His face went still. A particular quality of stillness she did not have a word for. Not anger, not guilt. The stillness of a man who has moved his pieces with great care and turned the board to find the game already over. "Where did you get this?" he said. His voice was very quiet. "That's not relevant," she said. "Clara." "Grant." She kept her voice level, almost gentle. "I don't want to destroy you. I want to be clear about that. I take no satisfaction in the idea of your empire coming down. I want to leave. I want to take our child and build a life that is honest and mine. I want to do this without a years-long legal battle that is expensive and painful for everyone, especially for Frances." He looked up. "Frances," she said. "That's what I'm naming her." It seemed right. He absorbed that. "The terms I've given you are generous," Clara said. "I could ask for considerably more, and any court in this state would support it given what I hold and what I can document about the past 8 months. I am choosing not to, because I believe clean is better than complicated, and I think on reflection you will agree." He looked at the second page again. He looked at her. She watched it happen. The assessment, the rapid calculation of positions and possibilities and exits, the search for a move. There was no move. She had the documents. She had Delia Hartman, who had 3 years of specific detailed knowledge and was now prepared to provide it. She had Douglas Fairchild, who controlled the trust protecting their child with walls Grant's own father had specifically designed to keep Grant out. She had Margaret Holt. She had the medical records from a hospital stay directly attributable to the stress he had introduced into her 8th month of pregnancy. And she was sitting across from him, 34 years old, 8 months pregnant, more present and more clear-eyed than she had been in years. "I'll have my attorney review this," Grant said. "Of course," Clara said. "Margaret's contact information is on the final page. She's available from tomorrow." He stood. He walked to the stairs. He stopped with one hand on the railing. He turned. He looked at her for a long moment. She thought she saw something move through him, something below the calculation, something that in a different man, under different circumstances, might have been actual remorse, the kind that understands what was lost, not only what was at risk. He looked at her. Then it closed. He went upstairs. Clara sat at the dining room table. She placed both palms flat on the surface. She breathed. She thought about the morning 11 months ago when she had been 22 years old and sharing a closet-sized apartment with Petra, and the world had felt full of every possible direction. She thought about all the directions she had not chosen. She thought about what it had cost her to reduce herself to fit into the shape of Grant's life. She thought about what she was reclaiming. She got up from the table. She went to the kitchen. She took the crackers from the pantry shelf. She ate 2 crackers standing at the counter and she put the box back. And she allowed herself to feel, quietly and without ceremony, something she had not felt in a very long time. Pride. Not the pride of winning. The pride of recognizing yourself, of finding yourself still there. She signed the settlement 61 days after she had first stood at the top of the marble staircase and heard a stranger's voice from behind an open door. One day past her 60-day goal. She could live with one day. The baby had come early. 38 weeks and 2 days. A girl, as Clara had somehow already known without knowing. 5 pounds and 6 ounces. A considerable amount of dark hair, thick and determined, and an opinion about everything from the very first hour of her life. Clara had been in labor for 11 hours. Petra had been there for all of it. She had arrived at the hospital before the contractions were 5 minutes apart, armed with the specific sparkling water Clara liked, and a phone fully charged for music, and a quality of calm presence that Clara would remember for the rest of her life as one of the most sustaining gifts anyone had ever given her. Dr. Harmon had been steady and warm throughout. The nurses had been excellent. The room had had a window with a view of the city, and Clara had watched the sky change through the hours of labor, from night to that particular gray that comes just before dawn, and then, at 7:43 in the morning, the first actual light. The baby arrived with the morning. Grant had come to the hospital. Clara had not called him, but Douglas Fairchild had, with a brief professional notification, and Grant had come. He sat in the waiting room for 4 hours. When Clara was settled and the baby had been weighed and measured and wrapped and placed in Clara's arms, with the careful instructional efficiency of nurses who had done this 10,000 times, Grant was allowed to come in. He came in quietly. He looked at the baby in Clara's arms. Something happened in his face that Clara had never seen before. Not performance, not calculation. Something that came from somewhere older and simpler than any of that. He held out his hands. Clara placed the baby in them. He held his daughter for 20 minutes. He looked at her with a completeness of attention Clara had rarely seen him give to anything. She watched him hold Frances. She did not speak. She did not take the moment from him. Some things exist entirely outside the ruins of a marriage and must be allowed to exist there. A man holding his newborn daughter for the first time is one of those things. He handed Frances back gently. He stood. She started. He did not finish. He left. Margaret called him from the corridor while Clara was still learning how to position Frances for nursing and reminded him about the agreement and the final signature window. He signed 3 days later. From the hospital room where she was learning the specific vocabulary of a body learning to do something entirely new, Clara texted, "Petra, done." Petra texted back immediately, "Now it begins." She named her Francis James Whitfield, the middle name for the grandfather who had not lived long enough to meet her, who had sat in Douglas Fairchild's office with his careful hands and his quiet love and arranged $40 million of protection for a grandchild who had not yet been born, who had bought Clara a book about garden architecture and tucked a handwritten note inside it. Frances Clara said to her daughter in those first blurry, extraordinary days, when the world had reduced itself to this small face and this small weight and this entirely overwhelming love. Your great-grandfather was a complicated man. He had many complicated qualities, but he loved you before you existed. Before anyone else in his family was willing to arrange things on your behalf, he arranged things for you. She paused. That counts for everything. Frances looked at the ceiling with the expression of a person receiving a great deal of information and reserving judgment. 3 weeks after the settlement was final, Clara reinstated her architecture license. It was a paperwork process. Not difficult. She had maintained her continuing education hours through the years of the marriage, almost unconsciously the way you keep a door from rusting shut, even when you have no immediate plans to use it. She set up a drafting table in the guest suite, her guest suite now, in her house. The settlement had included the house the full assessed value option with the mortgage paid off, a negotiation she had felt Grant resist before the weight of the second page of her document made resistance impractical. She put the drafting table by the window. She put her pencils in the ceramic jar she'd bought at a market in Portugal before she met Grant. She put her old portfolio on the low shelf beside it. She reached out to 4 former colleagues. She started sketching, slowly, carefully. With Frances in a carrier strapped against her chest, warm and heavy and occasionally sleeping through the scratch of pencil on paper, and sometimes awake and looking up at Clara's chin with the alert, philosophical expression she had begun to develop. She started. The commission came 6 weeks later. A community garden in the Northeastern District. A neighborhood organization had been advocating for green space for 11 years. A small grant had finally come through. They needed an architect who understood urban ecology and was willing to work within a modest budget for a project that mattered. Clara said yes before she finished reading the email. She said it so fast she laughed at herself for it. She sat at the drafting table with Frances asleep in the bassinet beside her, and she opened her sketchbook and she began. She ran into Delia Hartman on a Saturday morning in October. The farmer's market 2 blocks from the house. Clara had Frances in the stroller, bundled into the small yellow jacket Petra had given her, and she was buying the last of the season's peaches from the farmer she had gone to every summer for 3 years. And she turned around and there was Delia. They looked at each other. Delia looked at the stroller. She looked at Frances. Something moved through her face, genuine and a little sad and without any trace of bitterness. "She's beautiful," Delia said. "She is," Clara said. "How are you?" Delia asked. Clara considered the question, held it for a moment, answered it honestly. "I'm really actually okay," she said, "which I didn't expect to be this fast." Delia nodded. She had the look of someone who had been rebuilding something, doing the hard, unremarkable daily work of it. There were things in her face that hadn't been there the day Clara had first seen her, standing at the vanity with the wrong perfume. A reckoning. A kind of quietness that comes from having looked at hard things clearly. "I'm sorry," Delia said. "Again, I know I've apologized. You were also lied to," Clara said. "You were given the same wrong map by the same person for the same reasons. I've thought about it a great deal and I genuinely believe you. You don't need to keep apologizing to me." Delia looked at her. "Thank you," she said. Just those 2 words. They did not exchange numbers. They did not make plans. They were not going to become friends. But they nodded to each other in the pale October sunlight. At the farmer's market 2 blocks from a house that now belonged to Clara alone, and they went on. That felt precisely right. Exactly as it should be. Late October. Frances was 11 weeks old. Clara was sitting in the sunroom. Frances was asleep in the small bassinet. Clara had moved in here a week ago, because this was where Clara spent her mornings now, and it seemed absurd to separate from the baby for the sake of looking organized. The baby went where Clara went. That was simply how it was. A mug of tea sat on the side table, going cold in the way tea always went cold in this room in autumn, faster than anywhere else in the house because of the single pane glass in the east wall that she had always meant to have replaced. She had not replaced it. She still did not intend to. She liked the cold in this room. She liked that it was impractical. She liked the orange tree, which now had 4 oranges on it, small and stubborn and deeply pleased with themselves, filling the room with a smell that was clean and slightly sweet and entirely alive. She was working. The Community Garden Commission was open on the drafting table in front of her. She had been working on it for 2 weeks, and it was becoming something she was genuinely proud of. A long central space with wide paths for accessibility. Raised beds arranged in a pattern that paid visual homage to the neighborhood's original street grid from the 1880s, which she had found in a historical archive and been delighted by. A covered pavilion for shade and for the programs the neighborhood organization wanted to run. Pollinator sections. A small orchard of 3 apple trees. She was thinking about the soil. She was thinking about what grew here, in this part of the city, in this particular microclimate, and what would thrive without too much intervention, and what the people who would use this garden every day deserve to find growing. She picked up her pencil. She set it down. She sat for a moment in the sunroom with her daughter sleeping and the orange tree and the cold tea and the October light coming through the impractical windows. She thought about the year. She had lost things. She did not minimize this. She did not hurry past it or wrap it in any convenient meaning that made it smaller than it was. She had lost the marriage she had built her adult life around. She had lost years. She would not call them wasted. She could see now that there were things she had learned and done and made in those years that were genuinely hers, but they had been years spent building in someone else's name, towards someone else's vision of what their shared life should look like. She had lost the version of herself who trusted readily and asked fewer questions than she should have asked. She had grieved all of it. She was done grieving it. She was 34 years old. She had so much time. What she had kept was harder to list because it was less visible, but she tried to name it anyway. Sitting in the sunroom with the cold tea, she had kept her competence, the intelligence she had always possessed, but had somehow learned to understate, to qualify, to offer at a slight angle rather than directly. The ability to read a room, to read a document, to read a man. The stillness that allowed her to sit with terrible information long enough to think before she moved. She had kept Frances. She had kept the orange tree. She had kept Petra, who called every Tuesday evening without exception, and came for dinner every other Sunday and brought wine and occasionally burned the garlic and made Clara laugh with a completeness that felt like the best possible medicine. She had kept Douglas Fairchild, who had sent a card when Frances was born. Inside it, in his formal, careful handwriting, James would have been so proud. She had kept her license, her pencils, her eye for what a space could be if you listened to what it needed. She thought about the morning 11 months ago when she had stood at the top of a marble staircase and heard a stranger's voice from behind an open door, and she thought about the woman she had been at that moment. One hand on the railing, one hand on her belly, still, waiting, trying to understand what her body already knew. That woman had been afraid. That woman had also, when it mattered, when the moment came, been very precise. She had asked the right questions. She had called the right person first. She had gone into the office she was not supposed to enter. She had photographed what she found without shaking. She had sat at a dining room table with a piece of paper and said, "These are my terms," and she had meant every word. That woman had done all of that while 8 months pregnant, while her blood pressure climbed, while the full weight of betrayal pressed down on her. She had been afraid and she had been precise at the same time. She had not waited to stop being afraid before she acted. That, she understood now, was what courage actually looked like. Not the absence of fear. The decision to be precise anyway. She looked at Frances. Frances was asleep with her small mouth slightly open and her fists curled beside her face. She slept the way all new babies sleep, with an intensity of commitment, as if sleep itself is serious business requiring full physical dedication. You will know, Clara thought, from the day you can understand anything, that you are worth fighting for, not because anyone has to tell you, but because you will grow up watching it be true. You will know that your great-grandfather built a wall around your future because he believed you deserved one, before you existed, before you had done anything to earn it, simply because you were coming and he wanted you to arrive safely. And you will know that your mother, on an ordinary afternoon, in the middle of the worst year of her life, chose to stay precisely herself. That is the thing, not the settlement, not the $40 million, not the documents in the drawer. The thing is, she stayed herself. Clara picked up her pencil. The October light was coming through the west windows at that low, long angle that only happens in this month, that particular quality of afternoon that makes everything it touches look as if it has been reconsidered, made more itself. The light fell across her drafting paper in a long, warm rectangle. She began to draw. Outside the window, the garden was going gold, leaves on their way down. The apple tree by the fence still holding its last 3 fruit. The late dahlias she had planted in September on a Tuesday when Grant was away, and the house was very quiet and she needed to do something with her hands that would still be there when October came, were crimson and rust, bending slightly in the cool wind. Still there. She had planted those dahlias while 8 months pregnant, on her knees in the garden with gloves that were too big and a trowel she had bought specifically because it was a color she liked. They were still there. She thought, starting over feels impossible until you're in it. And then it's just the next thing, and the next, and the next. You don't have to see the whole path. You just have to be willing to take the next step on the portion of it that's visible. Frances made a small sound in her sleep. A settling sound. A continuing sound. Clara smiled. She drew. The community garden was going to be beautiful. She could see the whole of it now, fully formed in her mind, the way the best projects arrived when she had spent enough time with them, not gradually assembled piece by piece, but suddenly, completely. Like something that had been there the whole time, waiting for her to look in the right direction. A long central pathway with benches at intervals, spaced for conversation. Raised beds at heights accessible to wheelchairs and small children, and older people who needed to garden without kneeling. The apple trees in the northwest corner where they would get the best light and provide afternoon shade to the seating area. The pollinator section running along the southern fence, a riot of lavender and echinacea and black-eyed Susan that would, by the second season, be full of bees and movement and life. In the center, a small open space. Unprogrammed? No specific intended use, just a place to stand and breathe and be in the world for a moment without anything being required of you. She had an idea about the pavement for that central space. Something with meaning in it, something about the neighborhood and its history, something that would reward the people who looked closely enough to notice it. She began sketching the detail. She had so many ideas. She was 34 years old. Frances was 11 weeks old and asleep in the bassinet. The tea was cold and the light was good, and the dahlias were still standing in the garden. She reached for the tea. She drank it cold. Cold tea was fine. She had a thermos for the next cup. She had long pencils and good paper, and a commission that mattered and a plan for what came after it. She had in a filing cabinet in the drafting room a folder labeled Francis Trust Documents containing the full legal record of what James Whitfield had done for his granddaughter in the last healthy months of his life. She had in her desk drawer a handwritten note from an elderly man who had known what she was worth before she had fully known it herself. Clara, for the garden you will build, when you have the time and the ground to build it in. James. She had the time, she had the ground, she had herself, which turned out to be the thing she had needed most of all, which turned out to be the thing that had been there the entire time, intact and waiting, behind every door she had been too careful to open. She opened them now, one by one, Frances breathing beside her, pencil moving across paper, the good October light falling in from the west, the dahlias still standing, crimson and rust in the garden she had made. She drew.